The FBI categorizes a serial killer as a person who commits 3 or more murders over a period that spans more than 1 month and does so for a pathological benefit. That is, they hunt and kill other humans for the purpose of self-gratification. The popularity of modern news media has seized upon the concept of the serial killer, buttressed by the public's undeniable and morbid fascination with the people who hunt others. In this environment, it's easy to imagine they only exist in fiction, another macabre product of Hollywood. The fact is, there are currently 25 to 50 serial killers operating in the United States right now. Because of their ubiquity in modern storytelling, it's easy to forget that the serial killer is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it's as ancient as we are, although hitherto undefined by the modern field of psychology. Serial killers rarely prey upon people they know. This makes them very difficult to track. Modern police techniques and forensic science has limited the time and scope at which they are able to act. This wasn't always the case. Less than 100 years ago, the authorities worked in the dark, without the benefit of modern technology, centralization, or any true, real understanding of what it was they pursued. In these dark days, serial killers operated in fog, carrying out their horror with virtual impunity. This podcast seeks to tell those stories. The Vampire of Dusseldorf was responsible for at least 9 murders and 31 attempted murders. His name was Peter Kurten. Kurten was born into poverty and violence in 1883. He was the third of 13 children born into an alcoholic mother and father. The family's situation was beyond hopeless. They lived in a 1-bedroom cottage, and both mother and children were regularly beaten by their father during his drunken rages. The home was grossly unsafe for children who were exposed to explicit sexual behavior. Kurten spoke of times when his father would order his mother to strip in front of the children and would engage with her in full view. These awful conditions caused him to run away for weeks at a time, sleeping on school grounds and foraging for scraps in bins and picking pockets to afford bread and cheese. Around this time, the age of 9, Kurten says he committed his first murders. Playing with 2 friends one day on a pier, he said he pushed one into the water, and the second, who couldn't swim, jumped in to help his friend. As they tried to climb out, the young Kurten forced each of their heads down again and again. Soon they tired and drowned. Authorities at the time ruled this an accident. Whether or not this is a true account of what actually happened or a wishful reimagining by Kurten's corrupted adult mind is impossible to say. But if true, it's a chilling insight into what he would later become. When Kurten was 13, his father was convicted and jailed for the crime of incest with his eldest daughter. This was enough for his mother, who filed for divorce and escaped with her children to Dusseldorf. If Kurten's mind was shaped by the violence and sexual abuse he was exposed to in his formative years, it was clear that whatever damage had been done could not be reversed. He was known to be a fairly wanton thief at this age, but his sadistic nature found an outlet with a strange neighbour in his block of units. The man was a dog catcher. He was ostensibly good at his job as the streets were mostly clear of the stray animals. He would round them up and bring them into his small apartment. They wouldn't come out alive, but the sounds that echoed from the man's living room suggested they were not euthanized humanely. The following extract comes from Normal, a play about the life of Peter Kurten by Anthony Nielsen. In it, Kurten tells his defense lawyer about his friendship with the dog catcher. Night after night, I would lie awake listening to those sorry whines and yelps and yearning to know what went on there. One evening, I was passing the dog catcher's door when I noticed it was standing just slightly ajar. A sweet smell hung about it, and a noise came from within, like the whistle of air from a punctured balloon. I summoned the courage to peer inside. It was a charnel house, Dr. Werner. And through the black cloud of flies at the end of the room and standing on newspaper was the catcher at his killing slab. A small dog trembled upon it. Just then I slipped in something, and he heard the noise and turned around and saw me there. I was about to run, but he smiled, put his fingers to his lips. Shh. Beckoned me to come closer. And I went to him. I closed the door behind me and I went to him. He taught me many things, that man. He took such pleasure in my happiness. We became great friends, and I would visit him regularly after school. I wonder what happened to my friend, the dog catcher. After his time with the dog catcher, Kurten committed acts of bestiality with pigs at local farmhouses. And after that became boring, he would seek to heighten his gratification by stabbing them in the neck and sides during the act. Kurten entered adulthood in Dusseldorf. His career as a petty criminal started at age 16. He became exceedingly good at thievery and later moved on to burglary. The rate at which he offended meant that he was caught multiple times. The German judicial system in the late 1800s did not have much patience for recidivism in male youths, and each capture led to longer and longer sentences until he was finally incarcerated for an extended period. He described his treatment while imprisoned as sadistic. The guards would keep him locked in dark, damp cells for weeks at a time in manacles. He would later claim his treatment at the hands of his jailers as the cause of his hatred towards society and his offending. His abnormal pathology manifested itself in prison. He would purposefully break prison rules as a way to achieve solitary confinement. This afforded him privacy in the darkness of a cell deep in the prison. Away from the cramped dormitories of the main hall and deprived of stimulus, he would let his mind invent erotic sadistic fantasies, which he claimed were enough to achieve sexual release without physical stimulation. Prison records from the time paint a disturbing picture of the boy and young man. One officer wrote that he appreciated every situation at once, and when a favorable moment arrived, used it adroitly to his own advantage. He had no consideration for his fellow prisoners, and would attempt to hoodwink the prison officials with extreme sycophancy. For example, when the man who usually said the prayers fell ill, Kurten volunteered at once. It was astonishing to see the piety with which he recited the evening prayers, the officer concluded. Kurten was an atheist. He was amiable and sly, recalled a fellow inmate years later. He liked to hobnob with the officials, and he was capable of brutality. He used to ask all the sex perverts about their crimes and give them advice, including how to conduct themselves on trial. After his release in 1904, at the age of 20, he enlisted in the army and was posted to Eastern Germany. His distaste for authority made him a poor soldier, and he recounted leaving his post multiple times to set farmhouses on fire. Rather than leaving the scene of the crime, he would stand back a little and become addicted to the sight of families and townspeople running around trying to save their livelihoods. Often he would stand so close that people, unsuspecting that he was the arsonist, would ask him to help them extinguish the blaze. He later said that while he set the fires for the pure thrill, he was fascinated at the possibility that a homeless man might be sleeping in the barn and would be burned alive. Kurten deserted from the army, and for that, as well as a number of assaults and robberies, he was imprisoned for another 8 years and subjected to the same brutality and humiliations of his youth. By 1913, he'd served that 8 years and walked away a free man, but the darkness inside of him had grown. In June of that year, 1920, he was hard at work enjoying his newfound freedom. He encountered a young lady called Maria Schaefer and took her out on multiple dates. On a Sunday night, after some dancing, he walked her through a wooded area and without warning began to beat her about the face and head. He kept her captive in the woods overnight, vacillating between assault and rape, and then calming her with soft words. "This is what love is like," he would whisper. "I won't kill you." Schaefer was paralyzed by fear, and she slept overnight in the forest, with Kurten at her side. In the morning he awoke and attacked her again. She recalled him transforming before her eyes. She begged him to calm down before he killed her. Strangely, that was enough, and he walked her from the forest and made her agree to not tell anyone about the attack. Kurten had evolved from the level of criminality he had displayed in his youth. Maria Schaefer was lucky to survive that night because a few days later he committed his first murder. To support himself, Kurten took immediately to robbing houses in and around Mulheim. He would specialize in two-story houses and inns because often the owners would be downstairs and he would be left to walk freely upstairs, taking anything of value. On one of these summer nights, he made a mark on a property in Mulheim, and that evening, while the occupants worked downstairs, he quietly ransacked the house, unable to find anything of value. Upon opening the last door upstairs, he found the room illuminated by the full moon through the window. Sleeping in the corner was a 10-year-old girl, Christine Klein, nestled within the blankets of a feather bed. Acting on compulsion, he grabbed her neck and squeezed. She struggled feebly for a little before becoming very still. Kurten then took a small blade from his pocket and drew it deeply across her neck and listened to the blood patter on the floor. Breathing heavily, he wiped his knife on the bed sheets and walked out the back. He returned to Mulheim the next day and spent the morning and afternoon in cafes listening to the disgust and outrage of the townspeople, which gratified him greatly. Some weeks later, again while robbing a home, he came upon another sleeping girl, 17-year-old Gertrude Franken. Again, he grabbed her neck and squeezed until the capillaries in her neck broke and she foamed blood at the mouth. In each of these murders, at the sight of his victim's blood, Peter Kurten explained that he would ejaculate. This would be the primary driving force behind his sexuality for the rest of his life. Violence against others. He was still developing his technique though, and despite 3 more attacks upon people walking through poorly lit German towns late at night, he was unable to meet his primal urge. Later that year, his activities came to a halt after he was arrested and jailed for robbery and arson and sent to jail for 6 years, serving an extra 2 for bad behavior. After another 8 long years in prison, Kurten was released, and he moved in with his sister in the town of Altenburg. Through a mutual acquaintance, he met August Schaff, who he would marry. August was by many accounts a hard-working woman of a strong constitution and well regarded by those who knew her. Despite this, she had a troubled past, which resulted in powerful insecurities which plagued her and left her emotionally reliant on her new husband. Augusta was born in 1880, 3 years before Kurten. When she was 16, she moved towns to take up work as a housemaid and found herself regularly in trouble. The records don't say she was promiscuous, only that she found herself in bad company, a kind euphemism for a behavior which was not looked well upon at the time. She was sent home and obtained employment in a factory and started a relationship with a gardener, which lasted until she was 31. During their relationship, the man had promised Augusta he would leave his wife and marry her. When after 8 years she finally pressed him on this promise in 1911, he ended the relationship. Distraught and betrayed at having wasted her youth on the man and being left spoiled and without marriage prospects, she shot and killed him. For the crime, she was sentenced to 4 years prison. After this track history, her marriage prospects were not good. So when her friend's brother cornered her one evening in her flat and raped her at knife point, she was fragile enough to allow herself to believe it could be something more, and formed a relationship with him. They married 2 years later and remained so until the very end. Despite his sporadic cruelty and his flagrant adultery, she cared very much for him, and strangely, he her in as much as someone with Kurten's levels of psychopathy can. Kurten managed to keep control of his impulses for a number of years. He worked as a moulder, his father's trade, and even became an official for a trade union. He dressed impeccably well. His co-workers would stifle laughter as he spent upwards of 30 minutes in front of the mirror after each workday, dressed in impeccable suits, smoothing his hair with a pomade shine. In 1925, he became physically abusive with 2 young housemaids he had been having an affair with. They finally accused him of rape after finding out he was married. He fought the charges and was acquitted, though he was sentenced to 8 months' prison for the crime of seduction and lewd behaviour. When he emerged from prison, his offending recommenced. At first, they were just a handful of attempted strangulations of lone women walking at night. Then, in 1929, something changed, and Kurten would embark upon what Germany and the rest of the world would know as the Year of Terror. In the next episode, we'll investigate the brutal and frantic spate of attacks Kurten would launch over the next 12 months, as well as his capture, interrogation and trial. Subscribe and hit the bell button to be notified of when Part 2, as well as more stories about the villains who occupy the fog of our history, are published. Thanks for listening, and until next time.